Hi everyone and welcome to my coverage of Game 6 of the World Chess Championships 2010. With the score at 3-2, Vishy was looking to extend his lead further, and for the third time in the match we saw the Catalan opening after d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight f3, d5 and g3. And play continued with the same book line as the earlier games, d takes c4. White gambits his c-pawn for lead in development. So bishop g2 and a6, the same line as in game 2. Game 4 was bishop b4 check. This move prepares b5, supporting the c-pawn, so Vishy stopped it with knight e5. Next came c5 and knight a3. Again, this unusual knight development with the same ideas in mind as the earlier games, namely to get the knight to c4. After c takes d4 and knight a takes c4. Now Topalov played bishop c5, which is the same line as game 2 still, in which Topalov had been doing fairly well before his inaccurate 25th move, knight e3. So castles, castles, and now the first deviation from the second game with bishop g5. In the earlier game, Vishy had played bishop d2. So this pins the f6 knight, and if black plays bishop e7 now to break that pin, then he's lost the tempo. So Topalov dealt with it via the weakening move h6. And Vishy, not wanting himself to lose the tempo, gave up the bishop pair with bishop takes f6. And queen takes f6, and next came knight d3, attacking the bishop. So white gives up the bishop pair, and as compensation he has a good lead in development and pressure on black's queen side. Topalov continued with bishop a7. Now came queen a4, asking black whether he'll play knight c6 or not, as now it will lose a pawn, but win white's very important light square bishop if he was to take on c6, and Topalov did play it. Knight c6. Incidentally, playing instead b5 gives white an edge after queen c2, bishop takes c4 and queen takes c4, as there's no way to save the rook at a8 from the bishop on g2. So knight c6 is what happened in the game anyway. Now came rook ac1 and e5, which is offering the gambit pawn back in order to win the light squared bishop, and Anand was willing to accept with bishop takes c6. Excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold. And here Topalov continued with b5 because he wanted to give the gambit pawn back and sacrifice another pawn for the initiative. However, Vishy didn't allow him to do so, as he has a plan of his own to get the queens off the board and thus make losing his light square bishop not so dangerous. Here he played queen c2, but what Topalov was hoping for was bishop takes b5. And after a takes b5, queen takes b5, e4, with a very complicated game, and the black bishop's looking very powerful with this clearing of the board, and there's almost immediately total compensation for the pawn. It was a strong and creative idea, and no wonder that Vishy didn't allow the game to go that way. So queen c2 anyway from Vishy. Now queen takes c6 and knight c takes e5, winning back the gambit pawn. And these bishops could be very powerful given the opening of the position, but the point is that now the black queen must move, and afterwards white will have queen c6, attacking the loose rook and the black queen, no matter where she goes now. So effectively, Vishy can force the queens off, unless Topalov is willing to give up a pawn. Here he played the move that the engines recommended, with queen e4, but I was trying to persuade everyone watching the game live that queen f6 was a good alternative, because after queen c6 black can play bishop e6, keeping the queens on the board and thus making his light squared bishop a very powerful piece. The problem is that white now wins a pawn with queen takes a6, but the compensation is immediate after bishop h3, because there's no queen takes f6, so now comes g takes f6 and black wins the exchange, although white has good compensation for it. Still, it's an interesting continuation, but unfortunately Topalov chose the engine move, as I said, which brought the game to an endgame situation fairly quickly after queen e4. So queen c6, now bishop b7, queen takes e4 and bishop takes e4. And Vishy is very good at playing endgames, and Topalov not so much, so it's better of course for Vishy to steer the game into one if he can. As always throughout this match, it's the correct psychological decision. So rook c2, preparing to double rooks, and rook f e8, taking control of the semi-open file and aiming at white's weak e2 pawn. Rook fc1 and f6, kicking the knight. Knight d7, the first of 13 consecutive knight moves from Vishy, probing for tactical complications that Topalov was able to avoid. So bishop f5, attacking the knight, and knight 7 c5, which is a nice outpost from where the knight attacks the a pawn. And if black trades off his dark squared bishop, then he'll lose the advantage of the bishop pair and have a tough time defending the d4 pawn. So bishop b6 defends the pawn with the rook. And now knight b7 threatening knight d6 and rook c6. So bishop d7 is a good defense. And now black is controlling almost the entire c-file with pawns and pieces. Excuse me. So knight f4, rook a b8 chasing the knight. So knight d6, rook e5, and knight c8 attacking the bishop and aiming to entice Topalov to trade off his light squared bishop. But no such luck, he played bishop a5. So now knight d3 to prepare b4 as well as gaining a tempo on the rook. Now rook e8 attacking the rook. So knight a7, sorry, attacking the knight. So knight a7 preparing to swing the knight into c6. So bishop b6 and knight c6 attacking the rook. And Topalov is renowned for overvaluing the bishops, and on more than one occasion in this endgame he doesn't trade them off when it would have been wise for him to do so, this move being one of them, as now he played rook b7, when bishop takes c6 would have given him a small edge. So rook b7 and now knight c b4 attacking the a pawn and provoking the weakening a5. Now knight d5, which is a strong central post, although black still has good pressure on the e pawn. Here Topalov finally relented and let one of his bishops go with a4, which is a strange decision, seeing as after knight takes b6, rook takes b6, white definitely has an edge, as the d4 pawn is difficult to defend, and what's more, the c-file is considerably weakened on the dark squares, and white is able to create a strong outpost for his knight with knight c5. So bishop f5 attacking the rook, and rook d2 taking aim at the d pawn, and rook c6. If white takes the d pawn now, then the e pawn is falling, so Vichy instead supports his knight with b4, and Topalov captured en passant. A takes b3, a takes b3, and now made it impossible to secure the knight outpost with b4, a wise decision, as white would certainly have a strong endgame in the resulting position. White can win a pawn temporarily with rook takes d4, and after rook takes e2, playing rook takes b4, but black's compensation means he can more or less win the pawn back by force, after bishop h3, creating tactical chances on the first rank and obvious mating threats if Vichy isn't careful. So rook bc4, further supporting the knight and making way for the b pawn to advance. Rook d6 and rook e4, hoping to exchange rooks, but of course Topalov doesn't want this and instead played rook b2, applying pressure to the b pawn. And after rook e1, keeping things solid, he played rook d2 with doubled rooks on the 7th, and now total compensation for the pawn. So knight e4, defending f2 and attacking the d2 rook. So rook d4, which is in fact an inaccuracy. After knight c5 we have repeated move sequence with rook d2, knight e4, and now Topalov found the right move with rook d3, taking aim at the b pawn, and the nan wants to exchange pieces and draw, so he played rook b1, hoping to exchange rooks. And after rook d takes b3, he played knight d2, protecting the b1 rook and attacking black's rook on b3. Topalov played rook b3, and not rook takes d2 of course, or rook takes b3. So rook b4, and now f3, ensuring there's no pressure on the pawn. From here it's very equal position and difficult for either side to come up with a winning plan. The game continued for 10 further moves and a draw was agreed. Topalov started using his kingside pawns now with g5, knocking rook takes b2, rook takes b2, attacking the knight, so rook d1, now king f7, getting the king involved, but really there's no hope here. Topalov's known for not taking draws until it's absolutely certainly drawn position. Fairly stubborn. So king f2, now h5, king e3, rook c2, rook a1, king g6, both players get their kings more active. Now rook a6, threatening knight e4, so bishop f5, now rook d6, rook c3 check, king f2, rook c2, and now a repetition of moves with king e3, rook c3 check, king f2, rook c2. And here the players agreed to a draw, so a good result as far as Vichy is concerned, seeing as he's a full point ahead and it's first to 6.5 wins the match. So now he's on 3.5 and Topalov is on 2.5, and play resumes on Monday at the usual time. So I hope to see you there, and I hope that you enjoyed this analysis. Please leave any comments or thoughts. Thanks very much.